In 1975, the Church Committee revealed something that changed how Americans viewed their government. The CIA had been conducting mind control experiments on unwitting citizens for over 2 decades. Drugs, hypnosis, torture disguised as research. They called it MKUltra. The agency admitted it, apologized, said the program ended in the early 70s. Most of the documents were destroyed, they claimed. Just a few boxes survived. The case was closed. Terrible, but over. But what if that's not the full story?
According to a woman who only identified herself as Carol, her father was part of something he never fully explained. He worked as a research assistant at a private psychiatric hospital in the Northeast during the late 70s. Carol was young then, but she remembers the nights her father came home different. He'd sit at the kitchen table, she said, staring, not drinking his coffee, just staring. My mother would ask what was wrong. He'd say nothing, work, but his hands shook. One night, Carol found documents in his briefcase while looking for paper for school. Clinical notes, patient names, chemical formulas she didn't understand, and a letterhead, a pharmaceutical company she'd never heard of, with a small notation at the bottom, contract fulfillment per federal guidelines. Her father found her reading them. She'd never seen him angry like that. He took the papers, Carol said, locked them in his car, then he sat me down and said something I've never forgotten. Some research doesn't end just because they say it does. Some research doesn't end. Carol's father worked at that hospital for another decade, then left abruptly, no explanation. The hospital closed 2 years later. Records were transferred to a state facility. When Carol tried to access those records years later, researching her father's career after his death, she found gaps. Entire years missing from the patient logs. The pharmaceutical company her father had worked with no longer existed. No acquisition records, no dissolution paperwork, just gone. She spoke to one of her father's former colleagues, an older psychiatrist who'd retired to Florida. He was willing to talk, but only briefly. Your father was a good man, he told her. He questioned things he shouldn't have questioned. That's why he left. Then the man said something else, something that stays with Carol. The program had many names. MKUltra was just one. When that name became toxic, they changed it. The work continued. It always continues. And then he stopped returning her calls.
The official story is straightforward. MKUltra ran from the early 50s until 1973. Director Helms ordered the destruction of most documents when the program was exposed. What survived, about 20,000 pages, was released following congressional investigation. We know what they did. LSD experiments, sensory deprivation, attempts at behavior modification through drugs and hypnosis. Horrible, unethical, but documented, acknowledged, over. Except the timeline doesn't quite work. For those who remember Watergate, the pattern is familiar. The CIA admits to wrongdoing, produces some documents, claims the rest were destroyed to protect sources and methods. But documents keep surfacing, not from official channels, from unexpected places. A FOIA request in the 90s revealed correspondence between the CIA and university research programs. The letters discussed ongoing behavioral research with federal funding. The dates? Mid to late 70s, years after MKUltra allegedly ended. The CIA's response was bureaucratic. Different program, different purpose, unrelated to MKUltra. But the research described was identical. Drug testing, psychological manipulation, human subjects who may not have provided informed consent. Same research, different name. Then there are the private contractors. companies that conducted research on behalf of intelligence agencies. Their records aren't subject to the same FOIA requirements. Private entities, commercial confidentiality. Several of these companies were subpoenaed during the Church Committee hearings. They provided minimal documentation, claimed most research records were proprietary and couldn't be released. Years later, when some of these companies were acquired or dissolved, their archives were supposed to be transferred to successor organizations or donated to historical societies. Most of those archives never surfaced. Not destroyed, not classified, just missing. What they never told the public is how extensively the program had been outsourced. Universities, hospitals, private labs, all conducting research with CIA funding, often without knowing the true sponsor. A file marked confidential until recently showed that funding didn't stop in the 70s. It was redirected, funneled through different agencies: Defense Department, National Institutes of Health, DARPA. The research continued, the aims remained the same, only the paperwork changed. And here's where it gets strange. Some of the doctors and researchers from MKUltra continued their careers, published papers, received grants, maintained academic positions. No consequences, no professional censure, as if their involvement in one of the CIA's darkest programs was irrelevant or protected.
The locations tell their own story. Montreal, McGill University. Dr. Ewen Cameron conducted some of the most brutal MKUltra experiments there. Psychic driving. Patients subjected to weeks of chemically induced sleep. Loop recordings played continuously. Electroshock far beyond therapeutic levels. The hospital building still stands, now part of the university's modern complex. But the basement levels where Cameron worked were sealed off decades ago. Officially for structural reasons, asbestos, building code violations. But former maintenance workers describe something else. Rooms that were gutted so thoroughly, no trace of their original purpose remained. Not renovated, erased. One worker who spoke on condition of anonymity described finding a room in a sub-basement that wasn't on any floor plan. It was lined with acoustic tiles, completely soundproofed. There was mounting hardware on the walls, for restraints, we figured, and burn marks on the floor in patterns, like someone had run electrical equipment there for years. The room was filled with concrete shortly after its discovery. No documentation, no official order, just sealed. Then there's Building 257 at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the Army's bioweapons research facility. MKUltra conducted experiments there. The building's history is partially declassified. Partially. Whole sections of the research logs are redacted. Not just names, entire experiments, methodologies, results, blacked out or removed entirely. The building was decontaminated and decommissioned, but access remains restricted. Not for public safety. The decontamination was certified complete decades ago. The restriction is administrative. Security protocols that don't match the building's current status. What's still in there? The photographs that survived the document destruction are revealing in what they don't show. Images of research facilities, lab equipment, clinical spaces. But no patients, no subjects. The research areas are empty, staged,
as if someone photographed everything except the actual experiments. Image 23B from the declassified archive shows a hospital room. White walls, medical equipment, a bed with restraints. But the floor. The floor shows wear patterns, scuff marks in specific locations, the kind of marks made by repeated movement, struggle. And on the wall, visible if you enhance the image, scratches, dozens of them, clustered near the restraint points. Someone was in that room for a long time. Many someones. The pharmaceutical records add another dimension. Companies that produced drugs for MKUltra were supposed to maintain batch records, production logs, distribution data. Most of those records are gone. Company mergers, bankruptcies, standard business document retention policies. But spot checks of what remains show interesting patterns. Large orders of specific compounds, delivered to facilities that weren't hospitals or research institutions. Private residences, rural properties, locations with no obvious medical research purpose. The deliveries continued well into the 80s. Drugs that were supposedly only produced for MKUltra, years after the program ended. And the subjects themselves, the unwitting participants. Some came forward, testified, received settlements, but others disappeared from record. Patients who were institutionalized during the MKUltra years, released, discharged, and then nothing. No death certificates, no subsequent medical records, no tax filings or employment history. Just gaps. As if they ceased to exist the moment they left those facilities.
So, what really happened to MKUltra? The rational explanation is continuation under different names. The research was too valuable to abandon. The intelligence community's interest in behavior modification, enhanced interrogation, and psychological warfare didn't end in 1973. They simply learned their lesson. No more centralized programs with dramatic code names. No more direct CIA involvement that could be traced. Instead, they distributed the research. Private contractors, university departments, defense research programs, all working on pieces of the same puzzle, none seeing the whole picture. This explains the funding patterns, the continued pharmaceutical production, the protected careers of researchers who should have been pariahs. The program didn't end, it evolved, became more sophisticated, more deniable. For those familiar with Operation Paperclip, this pattern is recognizable. When uncomfortable truths emerge, the response isn't to stop, it's to rebrand, reorganize, continue under different auspices. And it's probably still happening. Research into interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, pharmacological intervention in cognitive processes. All legitimate fields with legitimate applications, and all with historical roots in MKUltra. But there's a darker theory, one that researchers hesitate to articulate. What if MKUltra succeeded? Not in creating Manchurian candidates or perfect spies, but in developing techniques that actually work, methods of behavior modification that are effective, reproducible, and applicable. The official narrative says the research was largely a failure. Drugs didn't produce reliable truth-telling. Hypnosis didn't create controllable assets. Most techniques were too crude, too unreliable.
But what if that's a cover story? What if they discovered something that worked, and that discovery was so valuable, so dangerous, that acknowledging it publicly was impossible? This would explain the continued secrecy, not shame over past abuses, but protection of operational methodology that remains active. The missing documents, the sealed facilities, the careers that continued uninterrupted. All of it makes sense if the program produced results worth protecting. And if the results were successful, they'd still be used, quietly, carefully, with better controls and documentation. Not on random citizens anymore, that risk is too high, but on specific targets, high-value subjects, people whose altered behavior could serve intelligence objectives. You'd never know. That's the point. Successful behavior modification would be invisible. And there's a third possibility, one that former intelligence officers keep awake at night. What if the private sector has it now? The pharmaceutical companies, the tech companies, corporations with resources that dwarf intelligence agency budgets. They employ the same neuroscientists, use similar methodologies, conduct research that approaches the same questions from different angles. Behavior modification, psychological influence, pharmacological intervention in cognitive processes. It's called marketing, user engagement, wellness products, legitimate business purposes. But the techniques are descendants of MKUltra research. The knowledge didn't vanish, it transferred from government labs to corporate research facilities. And unlike intelligence agencies, corporations face minimal oversight. No congressional hearings, no FOIA requests, no meaningful accountability. The program didn't end, it privatized.
Nearly 50 years have passed since the Church Committee exposed MKUltra. The CIA has acknowledged it, apologized for it, claimed it ended. But the documents keep appearing. The gaps in the official record keep expanding. The questions keep multiplying. It's not about what's there, it's about what's not. There's no complete accounting of everyone who participated, no full list of facilities used, no comprehensive documentation of what was learned. The 20,000 pages that survived represent less than 10% of what existed. The rest was destroyed, the CIA says. But destroyed documents don't keep reappearing in university archives, in private collections, in unexpected FOIA releases that shouldn't contain anything related. The part they didn't put in textbooks is how normalized it all became. The researchers continued their careers, the institutions kept their reputations, the knowledge was absorbed into legitimate fields. As if it never really ended, it just moved. And the subjects, the people whose lives were damaged or destroyed by unwitting participation, some received compensation, small amounts, settlements that required silence. Others never came forward, never knew what was done to them, never understood why their memories were fragmented, or why they experienced psychological breaks, or why certain triggers produced inexplicable responses. You can see it in how carefully the intelligence community discusses this history. Acknowledgement without detail, apology without specificity, commitment to oversight without explaining what's actually being overseen. The behavioral changes are there too. Researchers who spoke openly in the 70s went silent in the 80s. Witnesses who testified became unreachable. Documents that were promised never materialized.
Not from natural causes, from pressure. Subtle, but unmistakable. What they never told the public is how far the research extended, not just in the United States, Canada, Europe, allied intelligence services conducting parallel programs, sharing data, coordinating techniques. All of it officially ended. All of it still hidden in classified archives across multiple countries. And maybe that's the real message. Not that MKUltra was an aberration, but that it was a foundation, a beginning, a proof of concept that validated an entire field of research. Research that continues under different names, through different organizations, toward the same objectives. The technology has advanced: neuroimaging, genetic analysis, computational modeling of brain function. The tools are more sophisticated now, but the questions remain unchanged. How do you modify behavior? How do you influence thought? How do you control the human mind? MKUltra asked those questions. We're still living with the answers.
In 2018, a cache of documents surfaced at a university library, misfiled, forgotten for decades. They detailed pharmaceutical trials from the late 70s, conducted by a private research firm, funded by an organization whose name appeared in redacted MKUltra documents. The trials tested compounds on institutionalized patients without their knowledge or consent, years after MKUltra allegedly ended. The documents were posted online, academic forums, Reddit threads discussing CIA history. They remained accessible for days, then systematically disappeared. Not just deleted, removed from cached versions, archive sites, backup servers. Someone wanted them gone. In 2023, a former intelligence officer gave an interview. He'd worked in CIA's Science and Technology Division. He wouldn't discuss specifics, but he said something revealing. The Church Committee only scratched the surface. What they found was bad. What they didn't find was worse. The interview was published in a small circulation magazine, then retracted. The officer declined further comment. But the question lingers: what didn't they find? And what are we still not being told?